Good morning. This is Nicola Alexander, Business Executive and current President of the Graduate Law Student Association at the Faculty of Law in the University of Toronto. To launch our Executive Speakers Roundtable to be held on February 12, 2020, I've invited a distinguished Canadian business leader to talk to us on everything from trade regulations, banking and financial regulations, to climate change. He is Deputy Chairman of TD Bank. He sits on the board of Brookfield Asset Management, Sick Kids Hospital, among other things. He's best known for being a diplomat, a politician, a lawyer. He's Deputy Joseph Frank McKenna. Here is a snippet of that interview. I want to start the conversation a little bit by talking about Canada's innovation and privacy laws. As a leader of one of Canada's most successful banks, how are you positioning your institution to continue to be a leader in financial services innovation in an increasing banking regulatory environment?
Yeah, I think it's a, it's a very provocative question. Increasingly, banks are technology companies. And if we aren't, we're not going to survive. We have a large clientele base, but it's a base that everybody else would like to have. And I'm talking people from Google to Apple to PayPal to Amazon and thousands of fintechs. So everybody would like to nibble some of our lunch. And so unless we're very, very fast on our feet, we're going to lose a lot of market share very, very quickly. So I would say it's fair to say that all of us have transformed into fintech companies. We spend at TD probably in the area of $3 billion a year just in technology alone. We've joint venture with dozens of fintechs. We have probably 100 people working at Communitech just on technology solutions. We have 12.5 million digital users on our platforms. We own an artificial intelligence company, Layer 6, which is providing us with some of the firepower for this new economy. So it's a case of either get with it or get out of the way because fintechs are coming.
So now we've talked about innovation in Canada. We'll move to another topic that we've heard so much about deregulation and or regulation. So let's talk a bit about deregulation and Canada's relationship with the US.
Okay.
We know of the introduction of Frank Dodd, which occurred in 2010, to essentially reform Wall Street and protect consumers.
Right.
So how has Frank Dodd changed the banking industry, and how will that shape the future of banking in Canada and the US?
Yeah. So that's a very topical question, but let's understand, first of all, why the legislation was introduced. In 2009-10, we had a meltdown in financial institutions that represented one of the worst crises that we faced on the planet, going back to the Great Depression. And it vaporized trillions of dollars of wealth, put hundreds of millions of people on the unemployment rolls, and created despair around the planet. Almost all of that misery emanated out of Wall Street. Let's be serious. Greed and selfishness on Wall Street, the profit-making motive, and a weak regulatory environment in the United States allowed a lot of this to happen. And the end result of all of that was a lot of people, including the President of the United States and others, said, never again will we allow banks to do that. And remember, at that time, Bear Stearns was failing, and Lehman Brothers were failing, and all of the shareholders were losing money, and homeowners were losing their homes. It was a terrible human tragedy. And so it provoked the congressional dynamic that led to legislative reform. And that legislative reform was designed to try to tighten up the rules so that people could not engage in such reckless behavior. Credit An agency was created to protect consumers, for example. The Volcker rule was introduced as part of this legislation so that banks that take deposits couldn't be recklessly trading in a proprietary fashion around the world. A resolution process was introduced so that the taxpayer wouldn't end up being on the hook as they were in 2009, 2010. So we have bail-in capital, we have all kinds of excess capital rules now, so that it's people who provide equity to the banks that are more at risk. Compensation levels for executives now are better regulated, so that you have to actually go before shareholders to end up defending your compensation, and you have the ability to reverse compensation levels for egregious behavior. Just a whole lot of provisions were introduced to try to modify that bad behavior. Canada was very innocent in any causation of the financial crisis, but we paid a huge price in that we had to end up introducing all of the same regulations. So it cost us billions of dollars to modify all of our processes in order to meet the provisions of Dodd-Frank. And now what we're seeing is a partial reversal of that under Trump, under pressure from his constituency, which tends to be larger businesses, and in many cases regional banks. Some of those provisions have been reversed. Now, in fairness, pendulums always swing, and they usually swing too far, and it's possible that we ended up with excessive regulation. With 2,600 pages of regulation at that time. So some rolling back may be warranted, but we have to hope that cool heads prevail and that we don't end up going too far and creating the kind of a moral hazard that led to this crisis in the first place.
Okay. So as a follow-up to that question, then what would you say? We talked about regulations being, overdone. So what would you say then is an optimal point of the elasticity in regulation? So by that I mean, how flexible do we need to be in terms of regulation or deregulation? And what areas do we need to focus on in particular so that we get to that right balance?
Well, I think in Canada we had the balance right. And in large measure, it was because we did have some flexibility to react and act quickly. And when the financial crisis hit, essentially the bank CEOs with the Governor of the Bank of Canada and the Minister of Finance worked very closely together to make sure that we had adequate liquidity to protect our economic base in the country. And I think that that ability in Canada is where we should be. The ability to make changes required and to have some flexibility. And the US system has tended to be much more rigid than that. And they have multiple regulators. In Canada, 5 or 6 phone calls and you can get all the decision makers in the same conversation.
Right. Because we know that some people, when it comes to managing things like fraud and money laundering, banks in particular have a weak spot for being, a bit more careful when it comes to deregulation and or regulation.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point because you could argue, and some people would argue, that banks are unnecessarily rigid in their lending standards now. But I can tell you, as a bank who's been through, has seen a lot over the years, and is considered to be one of the soundest banks in the world, that we will always err on the side of caution when it comes to any money laundering or fraud. The price that we pay is staggering. Not only will we have to refund hundreds of millions of dollars, but we end up with penalties and restrictions. We can't do acquisitions. We're grounded in so many different ways. We may have to take on excess capital or pay higher fees. So the price is very high to make a mistake. And so I'd say banks are extraordinarily scrupulous about their behavior. And now the bar is high because there's so many areas where you can get into trouble. There's not the usual gangsterism, money laundering involving drugs and so on. But you have to be careful of restrictions on trade with Iran, for example, or other countries that are on restricted lists around the world, North Korea being another one. And so you have to be very, very careful in knowing your customer and having extraordinarily robust compliance and risk systems to protect your the consumers of your product and your reputation.
And at the same time allowing for growth to happen.
Exactly. You don't want to make it impossible to lubricate the wheels of the economy, but you do want to protect against blatant fraud and abuse.
So we know trade is a topic, it's a habit practically among diplomats and lawyers alike. And you've been a diplomat to the United States from 2005 to 2006. Given that the US is one of our closest geopolitical allies, as well as our trade partner around the world, how do you see their fallout in terms of the war with China and in their recent dispute, the trade wars with China and the recent dispute with Iran, affecting the relationship between Canada and the US?
Yeah, I think our government, premiers, opposition parties have done an admirable job of defending Canada's interest with respect to the United States. Now, we shouldn't be having a conversation that uses words like defending our interest with the United States. It should be assumed that we would be compatible and supportive of each other. That has not been the case in the last several years. We've had a very, I think it's very fair to say, hostile environment south of the border, where the president threatened to tear up NAFTA completely and leave our trade agenda without any guardrails. Remember, 40% of Canada's GDP is associated with trade with the United States. It is critically important that we have protections so that we are not subject to abuse of power. And so his threats were very real. He put tariffs on steel and aluminum to try to make us capitulate and bend to his will. And I think Canada stood up very stoutly against all of those provocations and ended up getting a good trade deal, the USMCA as it's called now, and protected us on steel and aluminum. So I think we've come out of this okay. We still have a softwood lumber dispute going on. So we've come out of that okay, but we're still vulnerable because we have an ally south of the border that used to be the world's leader in terms of establishing rules of the game for trade through the WTO, and also a fan of globalization and opening borders. That country now is a protectionist country under a protectionist president. And so the recent deal with China is a case in point. It's not a free trade deal with China. It's a managed trade deal with China. And in some ways, it's not good for Canada because it mandates, for example, that the United States has to purchase, let's say, $100 billion worth of farm products. Well, that's $100 billion worth of farm products that we can't compete for anymore. So in that way, it's a negative for us. It also has rules of conflict resolution that fall outside the WTO principles. And that's not good for us. We like the rules of the game established by the WTO. The United States doesn't. They want to be able to use their muscle to overcome resistance to their particular on their particular files. So Europe is already filing a challenge to the U.S.-China trade deal. So that's worrisome for us. It's also worrisome for us that we're caught up in the games the United States is playing. One of those games is around Huawei. There may be legitimate security reasons for using Huawei kit in one's 5G system. But there are also compelling proprietary interests at stake in the United States to try to hold Huawei back while US competitors move forward. And it's hard for the rest of us in the world to establish which is which. Are these legitimate security issues we need to be concerned about, or are they protectionist issues that we need to be worried about? We need to worry about that. We also need to worry about being caught as the meat in a sandwich, where the United States is putting pressure on us to exclude Huawei. China's putting pressure on us to include it. And we ended up getting caught speaking meat in a sandwich on the situation involving Madame Wenzhou. There we did what we're obliged to do by the rule of law, which is to accept the United States request to arrest her when she landed in Vancouver. But it's resulted in a dramatic deterioration of our relationship with China. So we're helpless. We can't do anything that would breach the rule of law. On the other hand, China's angry at us, and the United States, which has it within its power to try to influence China on this, isn't lifting a finger to help us. So we're caught at the mercy of two great powers here, and it's not a very comfortable position to be in. So all of that to say that right now the world is a very uncomfortable world with respect to trade files, mainly because of the United States and now spreading into the rest of the world, an increase in protectionism.
So where do you see us going from here? So Canada, for example, we're caught, as you say, in this really between a rock and a hard stone, if you want to put it that way. What do we need to do in order to kind of, elevate ourselves out of that position somewhat?
So I think that we can't stand still. We've got to accept the fact that we're reasonably small in population, and that we need the rest of the world to be part of our market base. So we need to step up and provide leadership to the world, which is badly lacking now in terms of defending globalization as a legitimate policy instrument. I think that we need to continue to expand our markets beyond the United States. We are too dependent on the United States, and it gives them too much leverage with us. So we've now signed a free trade deal with Europe, CETA, but we're not really taking advantage of that and doing much trade with Europe. We need to do that. We need not only to sign agreements, we need to give our industries the tools and the energy to participate in those agreements. Similarly with Latin America, we have a number of agreements. We need to have more. We're part of TPP, which is kind of the global club for trade, which involves Japan and Indonesia and large countries of the world. So we are signatories, but we need to give more tools to our industry to participate in that. And we need to break down interprovincial trade barriers between provinces so that in Canada we are ready, willing, and able to trade with anybody under any conditions at any time. Because at some point the world will revert back to sanity, I think, and it'll be an advantage to us.
So thank you so much. So let's turn a bit to, we talked about leadership, and when it comes to this business issue, and it's also a social issue, many people around the world look to Canada as one of the leaders. And that's basically because what you have is the broadest variety of voices. The topic we want to talk about is climate change. So we know for you, we brought this question to you because we know in your background you have a variety. You wear a particular variety of hats.
I do.
A diplomat, a trained lawyer, former politician.
And also the boards that I'm on, I'll speak about that.
And the boards that you're on. So tell us a little bit about how in your role you see, well, not only the bank at TD, but the other boards at Brookfield Asset Management and Sick Kid General Hospital. How are you positioning these organizations, helping to position them to take a leadership role in climate change?
So I'm on the board of Canadian Natural Resources, which is the largest oil producer and gas producer in Canada. I'm also chairman of Brookfield Asset Management, which is probably the world's largest renewable energy producer. We have 22,000 megawatts at least of solar, of wind, of hydro. And deputy chair of a bank which prides itself on being the greenest bank on the planet in many ways. We've committed $100 billion to clean technology over the next 10 years. So we take that responsibility very seriously. I think the operative word in this, as in social relationships, as in family, is balance. We need balance. The world is not going to go off the carbon economy overnight, or even in the next 10 years or 20 years. It is going to gradually, I think, transition. And renewables are becoming an increasingly important part of that, and we should be very supportive of renewables and investing in renewables. But we are producers of carbon-based energy, oil and gas. The problem is we're not getting paid for it. We produce it, but we haven't given ourselves access to alternative markets in the world. Only one market, the United States, buys 99% of all of our production. The end result of that is that we're getting deeply discounted in selling our product to the United States to the point where we're losing as much as $30 billion a year of national wealth of Canada in selling our product to the United States. And we're not going to end up selling less, we're just going to end up making less money for Canadians. So we have to find a way to get oil and gas into other markets of the world. We also have to accept as Canadians that we can't have it all one way. We can't just drill, baby, drill. On the other hand, we can't just close the doors to half of Canada and say, too bad, you lose, you're not going to be able to produce anymore. We have to find a balance, and I think we're finding that balance. Alberta, which is our largest producer of oil and gas, is also, in my view, the largest laboratory in the world for environmental science. And it's because we're Canadians and because we've embraced the fact that climate change is real and we want to do something about it, that we're putting carbon pricing and regulations in place. The United States is going the other way, getting rid of methane emissions. Well, we're putting methane emission standards up. They have no carbon pricing. Well, we have very significantly escalating carbon pricing. The end result is that we have thousands of scientists working at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our carbon and extractive industries, and less water utilization and so on. So we have become, in many ways, a gold standard for the world on how you transition a carbon economy into a less energy intensive extractive process. If we're not doing that, who's going to do it? Nigeria? Saudi Arabia? United States of America? I would submit to you that right now Canada represents a global leader in how to try and reduce a carbon footprint in a carbon-based economy. And I think we need to keep supporting those scientists and that science and that innovation in our country. And as Canadians, accept that we have a balance that we need to find and support that balance.
So thank you very much for that, Deputy McKenna. And before we go, I'd like to introduce just the rest of our team to our audience, but also to take a couple of questions from the team for you. So we have with us in the boardroom today, Vanessa Oliveira, and Vanessa is the Treasury of the Graduate Law Student Association at the Faculty of Law. We've got Crystal Park. Crystal is the Vice President of the Graduate Student Law Association in the Faculty of Law. We've got Catty Gardhouse, and Catty is the Global Professional Masters representative in the Faculty of Law. We've got Talal Khan, and Talal is our Social Affairs Officer. And then we've got with us Sharia Koka, and Sharia is a business leader in equity financing in Toronto at MKB Capital. And Sharia is also a candidate for 2020 in the Global Professional Masters Business Stream Program.
I have to tell you, I am amazed at your ability to remember all of this, as well as all of these questions and everything that we've done so far. It's stunning. You have a career in politics in front of you, I think.
Do I? I'm a trained diplomat.
Okay.
Thank you so very much. So now we're going to take a question from Vanessa, the Treasurer. Vanessa, you have a question for Deputy McKenna?
So in the Innovation and Technology program at the University of Toronto, we've been discussing a lot towards privacy and data protection.
Yeah.
And in the context of banking, while on the views of the client, securing its privacy is critical. On the other hand, for the banks to keep securing profits and increasing market share, it is critical also to have information on the client's behaviors.
Right.
So I would like to understand from TD, What are the strategies TD is using, like, to secure its reputation of a better bank in Canada and in US? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I would say there are a couple of thousand people around here that are working on that issue every day, trying to figure it out and trying to get the balance right. To start with, on privacy, there's no room for compromise. And you need to understand that we would have billions of transactions taking place every year. And we have customer information on 15 million or more, well, with probably maybe 25 million customers. So we've got massive amounts of personal storage of data. But we have to work extraordinarily hard to try to protect the integrity of that data. And the other thing we need to know, we live in a world of constant attack. We would have tens of thousands of denial of service attacks on us every day. We've got entire war rooms set up just to try to thwart the incoming cyber attacks that we have all the time. We've got I think 30 people working with the Cybersecurity Center at UNB in Fredericton just on cyber. We have offices in Israel just on cyber. So it's a huge concern for us. So we have to do that. A data breach for institutions like ours, you would have seen some of the more recent data breaches have taken place. They just cost companies billions of dollars, and more importantly, reputation and mind share, all the time that you have to spend on trying to fix that. So we work very, very hard at that. On the other hand, we make our living off of using data for the benefit of our customers and clients, and in turn to the benefit of our shareholders. And we're pretty new at this. The fintechs are really good at massaging data, using data, taking data they get from other people, screen scraping, if you like, and then turning that data around and making money off of it. So we're really just learning how to do that, and so we have to protect the privacy of data on the one hand. On the other hand, we're starting to use artificial intelligence tools to aggregate data in ways that we can be more useful to our clients and give them choices which we couldn't have given them before. So right now, you've just, with that question, I think you've probably put your finger on the largest single issue that financial institutions are wrestling with right at this moment, getting that balance right.
And we've got a question now from Crystal.
So as a foreign educated legal professional, one of the things that you really learn a lot once you enter Canadian law school is about Indigenous people, Indigenous rights. And of course with the oil and gas industry, which is a booming industry in Canada, for example, I think that it is also a matter of balance between sustainability and renewable and oil and gas, where there's a big carbon footprint, but also in regards to Indigenous rights. So with that said, can you kind of, I guess, put some light in regards to what kind of balance would be most ideal in this space?
Yeah, so this is one of the great public policy issues facing our country. And I think it speaks well of us as a country, if I can be self-indulgent for a minute, the fact that it is preoccupying us so much. There are a lot of countries in the world where the position might be to heck with them. Let's just get stuff done. And that might be true in too many countries in the world. But in Canada, we have not always been successful, God knows. But I think there's been a spirit of goodwill and an effort always from Canadians to be accommodating to our First Nations. I think there's a lot of respect and a lot of effort, but not always successful. Now, the energy sector is one of those examples where you have a real friction in trying to get this right. And it's hard because it's hard. It's hard because the courts have given rights. First of all, it's hard because in the case of British Columbia in particular, a lot of treaties have not been negotiated. Most of Canada, there have been treaties. But also because courts have given increasingly large rights to First Nations communities, but they've also left those rights defined in such a way that different people interpret them differently. For example, many people in the Indigenous community would say they have a veto over resource development. Those on the other side would say, no, you have the right for consultation and accommodation. There's a big difference, a huge difference. And so that's created a lot of cleavage, and jurisprudence is evolving as we go through this. And it's complicated further, I would submit, by the governance structures, which we need to respect in First Nations communities. A good example is the coastal gas pipeline that's now being built to deliver gas to Kitimat. First of all, the LNG terminal in Kitimat is supported by all of the First Nations communities associated with it. And the coastal pipeline has 20 Indigenous communities that it goes through on the way to Kitimat. All of those communities have signed on and are supporting that project. But within several of these communities, they've got a complicated governance structure that provides authority not just to the elected chiefs and band, but to tribal elders as well, in what they call the clans. And so they're claiming that they have authority as well. So I'll put the rhetorical question to you. If you've got 20 Indigenous communities through all their elected people that have signed on, does that give you authority to proceed? If you've got historical, I guess, or if you've got elders who claim through another governance process that they have rights, which rights prevail? And does it need to be everybody sign off? And is it every community? Is it every member of every community? Those are the kinds of issues that we're getting into. I think I think the court has finally come down now and said there is consent, accommodation, and that project should move forward. But the clan chiefs are saying no. We don't agree with our elected chiefs. So that's one of our complications. I think the way that we're going to reach accommodation increasingly is that First Nations will become equity owners of a lot of our large infrastructure projects. In the case of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which would simply twin an existing pipeline that's been in existence for 50 years, we've got at least 46 communities en route who not only support the project and want the economic benefits, but want an equity stake in it. The Government of Canada own that project. They are prepared to give equity to First Nations. And now it's just a matter of figuring out which First Nations and how. There are still several of the communities en route that don't support the pipeline. So then you get into the question is, should 46 out of 50 be enough? Does it require unanimity? And can equity stakes in the project overcome some of these differences? My own view, and to close on this, is that all large resource projects from here on in Canada will have equity participation by First Nations. They will become owners. And I think through that, we will end up resolving some of the issues. And they should be receiving licenses and fees, jobs, associated economic benefits. I think that will resolve some issues, but not all.
You're welcome. So we'll take one last question if anybody has any. Other than that, we'll move forward.
Yeah. So Frank, thanks so much for having us. It's a great treat for me to have this opportunity. So I'm curious about the intersection of tech and employment. There's a large sentiment in the marketplace saying that AI, machine learning, and different types of technologies will start impeding on people's ability to be employed by different firms. Where do you see the future of the intersection between technology and employment?
Yeah, so the world is changing so dramatically for people of my generation, it's hard to keep up with. It's hard to believe, for example, the biggest auto company in the world is Uber, or the largest hospitality company or hotel chain in the world is Airbnb, or that within years vehicles will be autonomous and we won't have truck drivers, for example. All of these things are happening. It's creating a lot of social friction, and there is no doubt there is job loss. I'll just give you an example. In the last 10 years in the United States, I think there's something like 5 million factory jobs lost. That's created huge friction and, quite frankly, led to people like Donald Trump and their rhetoric. During that same period of time, the productivity or the output of those factories has doubled. Now, those 5 million job losses, if you listen to the rhetoric of many, basically went to Mexicans and or other immigrants taking their jobs. In actual fact, probably 85% of those jobs weren't lost to Mexicans, they were lost to robots and technology. And that's the dilemma we face everywhere in the world. It's part of the reason for Brexit as well. We're seeing that friction of job losses and immigration, and people are associating the two and say, I'm losing my job because of immigration and so on. I think that association is wrong. And I think that we can have a world of globalization and immigration that's totally compatible with strong economic growth. Because at the same time that we have all of this friction, we have the lowest unemployment rates that we've had in 50 years. Everybody, I'd say everybody but everybody really in a way that wants to work can work. And so in many ways technology is creating jobs as well. And artificial intelligence, it's disintermediating, but it's also creating jobs. You know, in our banking sector, we're up to 90,000 people working at TD now. And yet every ATM machine that we introduce replaces 3 tellers. Every digital platform we introduce replaces somebody. But there are new people coming who are repairing digital platforms or who are doing other kinds of work. My own view would be that there will be a massive displacement and dislocation and friction that we need to address through retraining, reskilling, and understanding, but that the end result will not be major unemployment, but different jobs and better jobs. And that we need to gear up and equip the world for that, and not be Luddites and put our hand up and say no mas, no more technology, no more innovation. That's not going to happen. The Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones. It ended because something better came along. Something better is always coming along.
So thank you guys very much. And thank you, Deputy McKenna, for sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us, and your whole host of intellectual knowledge that we know is such a good part of your life and your business experience. We believe you have a final word for our group of graduates, 2020 graduates at the Global Professional Masters Program.
Well, to start with, thank you for allowing me to indulge myself in all kinds of opinions that are not widely shared by many people. So that's an indulgence that I appreciate. But secondly, I really want to take a moment to tell you how grateful I have been to have been trained as a lawyer. It's been really the greatest intellectual gift in my life. The discipline of law, the base that it's created for me, and it will for everybody else as well. With that law degree, you can be successful in business. You can use it as a legal career. I was a real lawyer for a long time, and I loved every minute of it. It's a great base for a political career, for a diplomatic career, technology career, as the case might be. It's not just a body of knowledge; it's a discipline, and it's an understanding of of just the way ideas are formed and contested, that's a powerful force in the world. And so I really applaud all of you for undertaking this body of knowledge and for the work that you're doing, and you're all going to have a powerful tool in the future for the great contribution that you're going to make to humanity.
So with that, we want to say thank you to Deputy McKenna for sharing his time with us, and to all of the committee of the Global Professional Master's students in the audience. And we want to thank Nicola and his team for coming out and making us looking so good and so professional.
Yeah.
Thank you all, guys.
Thank you. Okay.